Good morning, Talbot County, and thanks for joining us this morning. This is Two Teachers and a Table. We are your hosts, Mr. Bergman and Mr. Ripka. Today we have a special guest with us, Mr. Thompson. The topic this morning will be democracy. Specifically, we would like to talk about why our founding fathers thought that a direct democracy would be more harmful, or what was wrong with a direct democracy as opposed to a republic. We're going to be anchoring our discussion mostly with the Federalist Papers here, written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. 85 letters they wrote to newspapers in the 1780s. And so I'd like to begin by asking Mr. Thompson to tell us a little bit about the Federalist Papers.
Well, thank you for having me. And what I will tell you, just with the critical period as this was known in American history, it was a rare time for a group of people, a small group of people, which is different than a direct democracy, to decide our government. It was a very unique time. And basically for the United States, a new country, they were dealing with the failures of their first attempt to create a new government, the Articles of Confederation, which was known as a loose confederation of their states, a loose federation of their states. And basically nothing was done with their equal proportioned vote for their federal laws.
What, if I may interrupt for a second, what exactly did our founding fathers find, wrong with the Confederacy? The fact that nothing was being accomplished?
The big deal for them is they had, in a way, chaos. They had no national government to regulate their group. The Confederation really was that. It was not a nation at all. It was a group of states. You were a Virginian and not an American. That wasn't really defined at the time.
Would this be something like the EU today?
In a way, there's definitely some parallels to that, I think, because you think, how people are going away from the euro. A lot of nations are going away from the euro, so it is an interesting parallel for sure.
Interesting. Well, what I'd like to do then, was there any other background information you'd like to provide?
Just the only other thing I was going to say, so that the Constitutional Convention was designed to create a new government, and they had a lot of compromises of that time. But even after that, during the ratification process, you have these Federalist Papers and AntiFederalist Papers to debate why this new proposed government is acceptable or not. And I think we're going to get into today about the works that they do, but it was certainly talking about these ideas with direct democracy and republic.
Mr. Thompson, do you think that the Civil War was actually the realization of the agreement between Federalists and non-Federalists, because the South continued to probably live a little bit more Confederate at that time, anyway?
I think the Civil War, we talked, when I used to teach U.S. history, we talked all the time about it was the end of these failing compromises, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, for example. And it was an attempt to make everybody happy, which we'll talk about in the Federalist Papers, and even with the Enlightenment. You actually have to be willing to give up something to achieve natural rights, for example. And to me, the Civil War was a mark of somebody had to give up something at this point. And they kept trying to make a fair, equal compromise that everybody be happy with, and they couldn't do it. So the Civil War was kind of that drawing of the swords, if you will, to make that distinction and to make a decision. And you have some huge amendments that come from that, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, which we could argue today has a huge standing in our government.
I heard you mention the word natural rights. Is that right? What exactly do you mean by natural rights? Is that a question that we can answer?
Absolutely. So John Locke was known for explaining natural rights, that every person has this opportunity. And you think of the Enlightenment period, where you are transitioning from an absolutist regimes and organizations. These enlightened thinkers are challenging that, and they, just like the Federalist Papers, are a challenge to new ideas and applying a lot of these enlightened ideas. Natural rights is where every single person has those same opportunities. and we only translate that in our critical period.
And is this in the Declaration of Independence where they say we have inalienable rights? Is that a synonym for that, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness?
Absolutely.
But if I remember correctly, Locke has it a little differently. Doesn't he say life?
Property.
I think he says life, liberty, and the pursuit of property.
Property is funny because you have it later on in the Fifth Amendment. Your due process, that your property won't be taken from you. So it comes back.
It does come back.
It comes back.
I like that.
Mr. Thompson, it's interesting, too, when you talk about the fact that natural rights influenced our forefathers to consider some form of democracy. Initially, those same ideals actually created the English Bill of Rights. Why were the Founding Fathers not satisfied with their lot under the British government? Because they did have a Bill of Rights. They had a parliament that had become more and more representative. Why were they not happy with that?
Certainly with the English Bill of Rights, it was certainly something that was kind of forcefully established, I think, and it was one of those, you think of the different British kings that did things that were forceful, and then some things weren't actually into fruition, didn't actually happen. But maybe this is the early example of government going underneath of those rights, passing acts where you really can't live. Tax Act, Stamp Act, for example. And you think of our government today, where we have we have our Bill of Rights, we have our opportunities, but think of all the things that the government does to get in the way of our daily lives. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of I think that's kind of what happens, and I think it's one of our biggest complaints about our government today. Because you think about it, who wouldn't want to have our complete freedoms, right to privacy, for example? But they're certainly not fully achieved, and I think that's what happened then.
Right.
This leads me to the question, really, of the morning, and that is, if we were trying to get away from this monarchical rule. Why is it that the authors of the Federalist paper, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, went with or argued for a republic where you have representatives of the people, as opposed to a direct democracy where the people aren't represented? They are the government. They are voting for whatever it is they want to vote for, and they require no intermediary person.
I think the biggest complaint, and even why the articles were so weak nationally, is because of states' rights. I think you have people that, again, a Virginian, a New Yorker, that was gold to them. That's all they cared about. You didn't travel that far. You had to be really wealthy to travel out of state, or a vacation home was 10 miles away or something like that. But for the Federalists, what they are trying to do, and what the Constitution Convention was also doing, keep in mind this was a collection of wealthy people that were designing our new government. They're trying to tell everybody else that, hey, we're not giving the power to just us. How do we do that? Well, we make a republic. We don't just give this group of people a lot of authority. We keep everybody involved. How do we do that? With the Republican design. The Republican design is intended to do exactly what you're talking about. It's that representation. That's what a republic is that representation in your government. It's a confederation, but it goes further in that there is also a stronger federal level as well. Okay. Mm-hmm. I see that. And we're talking a little bit really about Federalist 1, I think, is what we're kind of hovering around here. That is, what we're talking about is the goal of the Federalists. You had mentioned before that there are anti-Federalists out there also. What was their argument? So if we go back to natural rights, for example, and was also discussed there, human nature. They had a huge disagreement in how we behave as humans. So the way they define human nature. Yep. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. So you think of a direct democracy, for example, that's trusting human nature. That's saying that we're going to make the best decisions. Optimistic outlook on how a human behaves. And absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And if you go back to the philosophy of Locke, under Locke, you have to assume that people are good by nature.
That's what Locke assumed?
Right, exactly. And if you look at Hobbes, he's just the opposite.
They're brutish.
Right. Hobbes says that, right, life is short, life is brutal.
Nasty, I think.
Yeah,
I mean, he
nasty,
uses
short,
very,
brutish.
yeah, that's the three words.
And ironically, what's the pen name for the anti-Federalists? Brutus.
B-R-U-T-U-S, Brutus.
Brutus.
Oh.
So you think of what they're trying to persuade, because another thing to think about, they don't use their names, they use these pen names.
And so they were using Brutus.
Brutus, which is the opposite of what they were, because anti-federalists, they believe in human nature. They're the states' rights. They're the, we trust our own ideas. We don't need somebody else to do it for us, not an elite group or anything. It's that group.
Of course, Brutus is coming from the Latin word that roughly means brute itself, but it also has connotations of Brutus and Caesar, I imagine.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right? That is, they were probably looking at the Federalists as a sort of Caesar-like character.
Absolutely.
Who wanted complete control.
Mm-hmm. And Federalist number 1, Alexander Hamilton, he has such a unique story. Born out of wedlock from the Virgin Islands, coming to New York, competing with the wealthy, and he sees that and he respects that, and it's a very very unique life that he lives. He marries wealthy. He really gets into that lifestyle, but it's kind of funny how he really says what he sees here, what he sees in this elitist group, is he does see a smart, intelligent group of people that can help where he came from. And that really is the idea of the Federalists, that yes, we're going to create this elite group, but hold on, it is a benefit. It's better. It is a better way of life living that way. And you kind of see that today in our government, where people do complain about our representation. You complain of the protests that you see in our government today. It's an interesting parallel to, if Hamilton was here today, I'd say he'd look at those protests and he'd say, this is the problem when you have, people doing it as they please. You need a government to say, this is the direction we're going to get more done.
And if you look at the background between Locke and Hobbes, Locke, he was much younger than Hobbes. He had experienced the Glorious Revolution in England, where people, democracy was introduced. The king and queen were forced to sign a document giving them basic rights. Whereas Hobbes lived during the English Civil War, when there was absolute chaos, following the beheading of Charles I, until the Puritans tried to get things under control. And the Puritans also, in order to get things under control, ran a fascist regime under Oliver Cromwell. And people were certainly no freer or happier under Cromwell than they had been under royalty, which is why probably the monarchy was eventually restored. So at least they would have a parliament that would be a little bit more representative. The king's power would be in check, unlike Oliver Cromwell, who, you didn't dare question his authority.
Are we suggesting that Hamilton believed that the people would elect enlightened representatives?
He did say that, and he didn't always agree with Madison, but in Federalist number 10, if we do talk about factions, one thing that he does acknowledge is you're not always going to get it right. He actually does write that in Federalist.
Hamilton writes that.
Madison.
Madison writes that.
In number 10.
In 10, okay.
Yep, so, and we'll get to factions, but when he does mention the election process, he says, you know what, you're not because you're not going to vote for someone who agrees with you completely. That just won't happen. But it is still better. It is still better.
Then if we had everybody's vote count individually, and it was more, you just count up the votes, and if 60 people have voted and 40 voted the other way, well, this one wins.
Right.
You're saying it's better to have that you vote for a representative, and the representative, the enlightened representative, then votes for you.
Yep.
Then we have to hope that the representative represents our interests, the majority of interests.
Correct. But here's the thing. If you have that representative, you know for a fact what that person is going to, you should know what that person is going to do for you. If you have this direct democracy where everybody does as they please, you don't know what to expect. Everything sounds good and fine, that everybody's going to say is they're going to help each other out, but it's almost like you're lying to themselves, to yourself. From an elitist perspective, and that is part of the Federalist Papers, they analyze human nature, and they say, well, you're kind of lying to yourself saying that everybody's going to help one another. There's going to be a farmer who's going to have a rough year, and he's going to try to pull some strings to help himself out. It's going to happen. But if you have a representative that can represent all of you, it's a more, I shouldn't say direct, it's a pure connection to what you're going to get.
Are you suggesting that our founding fathers actually have a sort of Hobbesian view of human nature as opposed to what we were saying before, a Lockean view? That is, that our founding fathers, as enlightened and noble as they were, thought human nature was brutish and nasty and selfish.
Absolutely.
Well, I think, too, part of that comes in their elite background. I mean, these are very educated men of the Enlightenment who are very privileged. Most of them, do come from money originally. They've become the new aristocracy of the United States. And sometimes the upper classes feared the great unwashed, or you knew you had to manipulate them because they were not educated. They weren't politically aware. They didn't look for political solutions. They looked for quick solutions that would help them. And that's where you end up with, with revolutions. The political, whatever was going on politically, they didn't feel were meeting their needs, so they rose up against the government to take what they wanted, but they didn't know what that meant because they weren't politically savvy. And so, I can understand.
Because there's no process.
Right.
And you teach with the three estates with the French Revolution. There was no process for the third estate, excuse me. Right. So look what happens. It's revolution.
Just so I ask, the third estate being what? Just so
the majority of France, but also those without bread.
The poor.
Though, the upper part of the third estate, the bourgeoisie.
Oh, are we kind of talking higher class, middle class, lower class in a kind of way?
Because even though they're third estate, you had a bourgeoisie class where many of them were wealthier than the aristocrats and sometimes wielded more authority. Because of the fact that they were self-made. And what did they do but steer the masses into being the tool that they wanted to rebel? They themselves didn't go out in the streets, hacking off heads and putting them on pikes, but they got the underclasses to do it and encouraged them to do it.
And I wonder if it's because it's, once again, this sort of human nature that we're talking about, that many of the people involved in this class are ruled by their passions instead of their reason.
Absolutely. I think that's really important.
It's human nature.
And to be ruled by passion.
And you think, it's interesting that you both say that, because if you look at Marat, who was the journalist at the time, he wasn't writing factual news. He was appealing to pathos. He was getting people fired up so that they would respond that way. They were completely unhinged by emotion.
Well, I think politicians use that all the time.
Sure.
They understand more and more,
Yeah,
right? They understand that if I use a rational argument, my audience is going to fall asleep, or I can only get to a few of them. But if I can rile them up passionately,
because the masses aren't capable of thinking
through logic and reason and things like this, or haven't been trained to do this through schooling or whatever.
It's hard to explain themselves when people pick apart different things or interpret what they're saying. Sometimes the public hates the truth.
Sometimes we all do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, you think of money doesn't grow on trees, for example, and where things come from, and where our government tries to provide, and people have to realize it comes from somewhere. It comes from somewhere.
That's a good point. Yeah, earlier you did bring up Federalist 10, and so I'd like to move over to Federalist 10 if we could a little bit. And I was wondering, essentially, why our founding fathers feared factions so much.
It's a funny paradox that they make, because they say it's inevitable to have factions because it's human nature. But factions, you think of today as political parties or interest groups, we all have interests. We all have different things that we like. That's going to happen. You can't avoid it. So for a group to come together in those ideas politically, is human nature. It's going to happen. But it's evil. And that's what Madison...
Evil, huh?
He notes that it's evil.
And for instance, a faction could be, as you said earlier, a bunch of farmers who had a bad year get together.
And why wouldn't they? Hey, did you get rain? We didn't either. So
so let's go to whatever. Let's put our vote in or whatever we're going to do to get what we want.
Yep. Help us out this year. We'll help you out next year. Or something.
And they think, the founding fathers think that a republic can somehow alleviate the fear of factions. And by that, I guess I mean not eliminate a faction, but control it. A republic controls the factions more so than a direct democracy.
I think it just keeps that standard process.
Which is?
Just in terms of representation, whether it's voting and in the other parts of the Federalist Papers, the government principles, whether it's checks and balances, separate, those things are, separation of powers, all those things are also applied to ensure this process. But in that sense, there's not going to be a rebellion, or it limits that chance for a rebellion because you have that process for, okay, you want to make a difference, this is what you do.
And factions could lead, if they grow large enough, to a rebellion.
It could change the process. And we talk about in my government class, because it is government and politics. Politics isn't in the Constitution, but we probably see in the news more politics.
Well, can you explain what that means exactly? So, politics is not in the Constitution?
Correct. Okay. So political parties are not mentioned in the Constitution, and George Washington also talks about in his federal address against political parties. He feared them. He said this is not a good idea.
Why?
You saw what happened in England with the Whigs and the Tories.
Sure.
And leaning towards special interests.
Sure.
Getting various people on their side.
What was he preferring? That you just individuals run for office and you vote for the character of that human being?
I think so. That's a good question. I'd have to look more into his farewell address. What's his alternative?
What's the alternative?
Because Washington's not much of a politician.
That's right. He's a general.
Yeah, he's more for the honorary side. So it's almost like you earn it. What's that called?
Meritocracy.
A merit system. That's a guess, but maybe he would say a merit system. I could see that as a general.
There's also timocracy, which is the rule of the honorable.
Sure.
So maybe it was something of that.
And that's certainly, that's pretty much why Washington became president, because he was an honorable person. He was no politician. He didn't say anything at the conventions. He although they say he's the tallest person in the room, Jefferson's almost as tall, being 6'1" and all. But Washington certainly was someone who had a presence about him, and that's presidential. Presidential presence.
He had an ability to command so much respect too that no one would actually argue with him when he came up with whatever he came up with. It was just considered wisdom. But they went ahead, and I always get the feeling too that the fact that he was older than a lot of them, and they. There wasn't quite a generational difference, but he came from more old school thought.
He was around for the French and Indian War, where others were either finding their way at that time. John Adams is still a lawyer, or becoming a lawyer at that point, and they're the older ones. Madison's not even in the picture completely at that point. And look at, he's in the Federalist Papers. Hamilton's trying to establish himself with the elite. So they're all, and Washington's really there at that point. He's leading the forefront. He's failing at that point. He's learning from his mistakes, which is also important too.
Since you're naming guys, I've heard of,
poor John Jay.
Poor John Jay, exactly. I hear so much about Hamilton. Well, we even have a musical now.
Right.
I've heard a lot about Madison, not just here at the table, but throughout my life. But poor John Jay.
Yeah, and he doesn't last long. Federalist Papers are being produced, and he dies.
Oh.
Poor guy. He's someone who did a lot of. He was the guy who went to France, went overseas, made those different agreements, and you think of the Jay Treaty during the different times. But John Jay is someone who he wrote a few parts of the Federalist Papers. but he was a respected person. He was the
was.
experienced guy. The fact that you send somebody overseas, John Adams went overseas.
Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin
over there.
Franklin over there. Jefferson. Those are people you respect. You don't send,
one of the anti-Federalists over
right,
there.
right. You don't send John Dickinson over there. You don't send a Quaker over there. Sorry, no offense to the Quakers, but you don't send him over there.
Yeah.
Just because he has a very contrasting belief, and these guys at least have that experience of
and they're almost in a way they're almost aristocrats in a way.
Sure,
I would say so. You're sending some of your elite over there. I think is what we're saying in a way. You send your best over to another country. Yeah.
So, what do you think? First of all, who do you think is the quintessential anti-Federalist, and why did the Federalists win?
Well, good question. So you have Patrick Henry, noted anti-Federalist. He's someone who, a Virginian, who had a large role in voicing his opinion. I think what really made a difference, quite honestly, is you have you have a lot of citizens that are upset with the articles. State issues between one another. Virginia and New York only go so far. You have 11 others that have a lot of issues. Maryland wants to have their rights heard. And if they have Virginia overrunning them, over time, they get tired of that. They get tired of the Patrick Henrys, for example. South Carolina, they're transitioning from being more populated by slaves to having more European citizens. They're getting tired of the big state. They want to be heard more. I think that's where the fall really happens, where you have a need for a national government to regulate interstate commerce, to regulate that, make it a national thing. I think that's really the mark. Not necessarily their opinions. I think it was just the time period. Just this is what was happening. Sorry, Patrick Henry, you picked the wrong time. If you were in the colonial, which he was colonial time as well, but if this happened colonial period, it might have been a little bit different.
And it wasn't a blowout, shall we say, or a rout. I mean, this was a legitimate fight, and the Federalists were concerned that they could lose.
Ratification took 2 years to happen. So, and it was because each of those states had disagreements. It wasn't a Federalist state versus anti-Federalist state. Even in Virginia, for example, they had contrasting beliefs. So you see that today, and it's just one of those things
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Did all 13 states have to agree to the Constitution, or was it a majority wins?
So they had to get 9 of the 13. Which was, you think of it, the significance, a very big difference from...
Is that still the state's convention? Or
it does, with the amendment process, yes, the 3/4 to propose an amendment. Yes, that does translate to
Which you still need 9 states?
3/4.
Oh, 3/4.
Yeah. So the western half is ready to go.
It's ready. Let's do it.
District 9, or
the East Coast or the West Coast.
Yeah, they're ready.
They're ready to move. We can do this.
But you think of that decision to say that we don't need everybody. That was a big thing too. Acknowledging that yes, we're going to have people that don't agree, and that gets into another Enlightenment idea with the social contract.
Of Rousseau.
Yeah. Yep. And that is basically the agreement that we're going to give up a little bit of our natural rights, which everybody has. We're going to give up a little bit of that authority of our rights. Somebody else will have that to make laws. I can't make a law. We can't make a law, but we can vote for those people.
What do we gain?
We get laws in return,
which protect us.
Which help us.
Okay, they protect us from others or whatever, oppression.
And the argument is, in order to achieve that, the best way to achieve it is to give up a little bit of it. It's like saying you're going to do your chores now to go play later.
Wow. Okay.
And yet you open yourself up to those protesters, because when man is not as good as Locke thinks that he is, you have people, you give up what you have to give up. I'm not giving up anything. I'm going to go ahead and do this.
Right.
Despite that, which of course, if that's laws, you're breaking a law.
Right.
one way or the other.
And that's going back
the
to
laws don't apply to me.
Yeah, and that's going back to factions too. I think that is, that would be a faction saying that we want our ideas to be everybody's ideas, essentially. And of course, our founding fathers think, as we're talking here, that the republic is somehow containing that more so than a democracy is.
And you think about how factions are seen as evil today.
Are they?
Well, bigger interest groups, NRA.
Okay.
NRA has a lot of funding, and let's put aside what your beliefs are with the NRA, but they make a big difference in government. The people that are in our Congress, they have an influence by the NRA for sure. And when they want votes, they talk to the NRA if that's an issue. Sure.
Could I just read what they say a faction is, just so that we can get that out? Because I guess a faction, NRA, but also Democratic Party, Republican Party. The faction I think could go on, right? Sure. So just so we see
Planned
Parenthood, yeah, a ton. PETA. A lot of things. We have here's from Federalist 10 by James Madison, written in November 22nd, 1787. It says, "By a faction I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community." I didn't realize that it could be a majority. I always thought a faction was a minority that was trying to take over. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the math term, yes, that is a fewer amount of people than the whole, trying to take over the whole in a way, or at least push their beliefs on the whole. I didn't know that you could have a majority and call that a faction, but according to that definition, it sounds like it.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at it, because to me, I almost look at it from a minority standpoint and say, well, how does that minority interest group make a difference? Mm-hmm. Well, what's the purpose of that? Why do you create that interest group? You create that to have a voice. For those people to come together. If they were separate, like a direct democracy, they may not be heard. So when they do form, then their voice is heard. So that's a purpose for them.
And they also, what's interesting is you have the identity politics that puts a lot of these groups in support of one another, even though under some circumstances they may never support one another. Mm-hmm. If they're up against a faction that they think threatens all of them, then they unite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought I remember reading in here something about, you can't eliminate factions, but you can contain them. But additionally, I thought I remember saying when you have a republic, you almost don't have to worry too much about factions, because they'll be fighting each other more often than they'll be fighting the government or trying to take over. They'll actually, as you're kind of, I think, bringing up a little bit, I guess what you're saying is somebody's out there trying to make these factions come together to a larger faction. Mm-hmm. But it sounded like, if I remember from my schoolboy years of reading this, that they really were thinking that these factions would be attacking themselves often, right? Fighting for their rights.
And that happens to some level, but we find once again that if several factions perceive that they each have a common enemy, then they join together to
form into a political party.
Right. and if they win that, then they're back to fighting one another. And then because some of their agendas are completely at odds with one another, and yet they join forces temporarily to fight that bigger demon, or what they consider the bigger demon. But what's interesting is anybody who can foresee those agenda know that when they go back and become factions against one another again, which one's really going to win over the other one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's a good point. I just wonder if the ones who join up with them originally realized that, that those same people will be in our demise later on.
Mm-hmm.
You saw that in the French Revolution with the amount of political parties, factions that had started up at the time, and that's exactly what happened.
I want to kind of bring it back around to the beginning a little bit, and just, you brought up that the Anti-Federalists used the name Brutus, right, for theirs, but the Federalists, I don't know if we've mentioned this, but they use a different pseudonym, right, and that is Publius.
Publius.
And could you maybe comment a little bit about why they would use Publius there instead of some other word, or why not even just say Hamilton, Madison, and Jay? Why not put their names out there?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that happens. Why are they anonymous? Think about today, how we have, op-eds, anonymous op-eds. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Sorry, just
no, that makes sense because they kind of are op-eds. They're in the newspaper.
They kind of are, and I think if you asked this question even last year, I don't think I would have said that. So it's kind of funny how this has come to the forefold here. But pluribus, which is, you think of how Brutus was used for the Anti-Federalists, even though it's kind of the opposite of what they're saying with Hobbes, is almost like a pluralist or a unity idea. So you're creating a strong central government in the Federalist Papers, but you're using a pen name that brings unity.
It's like public in a way.
Yeah.
The name has all these connotations of being a public thing. I mean, republic is coming from res publica, Latin, meaning the public thing.
Right. So you're naming you're designing things for public good with the design of again, I'll say elite, but a hierarchy, that isn't direct, but is for the direct group. It is for everybody. Everybody is under the law, even those people, except they can create the law. So it's an interesting paradox there. But it is an interesting pen name for that. And I think that is you want to attract the reader right away. Same preamble in the Constitution, Federalist number 1. Federalist number 1 has the same purpose as the preamble. It is introducing what they are trying to accomplish. And they are trying to start the argument to say to everybody, you see all these powers that we're giving this group of people, but hold on. Just wait. It's going to work. It's going to work. Just wait and see.
Are they saying, like, you see all these powers that we're giving to everybody, but you guys are going to be more free, actually?
Yeah.
Are they saying something like that? Or you guys are going to be more powerful? Like, you're giving your powers, but in the end, you're going to be more powerful.
They certainly add in all of these Federalist Papers the hold on, wait a minute.
Hold on, wait a minute.
Yeah, you see this and you freak out, but there's this for you. You have this idea. This will be supportive of you.
It's not a switch and bait, though.
It's not. Okay. Congress is going to declare war. You're not. That's not a give and take. You don't get it. But what's the benefit of that? Why are you giving a group of people to declare war? Well, it is going to provide safety. For example.
And it's interesting, too, what you said, that the Constitution doesn't define politics, but certainly that approach in the Federalists is politics.
Oh, for sure. It is.
It's a type of campaigning almost.
It's the process to get that government.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's still used today, I would imagine. We're going to have to wrap this up a little bit, but before we do, I would like if we could talk for a minute or two about, has our government changed drastically since the time the Federalist Papers were written? I know this is maybe an opinion, but I'm curious in both of your opinions if you think that the Republican or the government itself has changed since this time period and what they were trying to propose here. Are we still utilizing this, or have things changed so much that the Federalist Papers say a bunch of noble things that are interesting to talk about?
You want to go first?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's no way that they could ever have seen when they wrote these the type of immigration and diversity that the United States would become. They also couldn't foresee World War I and World War II, which changed the world drastically and changed the United States drastically. As a result, our government has tried many different roles in trying to maintain democracy. And some administrations have been very good about practicing democracy, and others have become very almost, I'm going to say authoritarian, but almost authoritarian.
Almost authoritarian.
And, depending upon what was going on. I mean, certainly if you look at the McCarthy era and the Red Scare that was going on in the country at the time, I mean, people were considered, guilty and before, proven innocent. And
so many,
that hasn't always been
many unforeseen things have occurred that there's no way these three could have known about.
I think McCarthyism, I don't think they ever would have predicted that. That's probably one of the few things that they probably would have had no idea about. Other things like globalization, they probably predicted we're gonna link at some point. But something like McCarthyism, somebody uprising in that way, where they have they're using the government against other people. Mm-hmm. What a strange thing that happens. I mean, how would you? Everything that you design, you don't really think that would happen. At least I think. That's a great point. I think for me, I think it's changed in an exponential way because of media, for example. Mm-hmm. And you think of how people are involved, and it's gotten to the point where everything you say and do is held against you, and to the point where every move that you do is with the involvement and intent of the people. Look at what the president's doing in terms of campaigning, and everything that he does has to be explained. Executive orders. Okay, let's go to the the West Wing. Let's see what the response. Everything has to have a response, and that is almost like a direct democracy in that sense, because you have an indirect democracy.
Twitter has led to a direct democracy.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. There's a response to everything. And it's it's that interaction with the people. So in a way, we're not changing laws, we're not creating executive orders or anything, we're not interpreting the law, but we are certainly influencing that.
And people as individuals too have also gotten to be part of the checks and balances system, rather than the representatives, the people at large. Do the same.
Overreaching power. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank both of you. I want to thank you, Mr. Thompson, for joining.
I enjoyed it. Thank you guys very much.
You're welcome.
It was fun.
Yeah, thank you for joining two teachers in a table. 3 teachers this week.
A colleague.
A colleague, exactly. And, of course, thanks to Mr. Bergman for all of his wonderful insights into our topics. Next week, we'll be talking about Blaise Pascal. So please join us next week, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks again for joining us.